Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be reading from the book of Judges, chapter 11, and the story is truly horrific. Therefore, I'm totally pumped about reading it and discussing it with you. That being said, please subscribe to my YouTube channel so we can read these terrible texts together. I'm going to read to you a portion from chapter 11, beginning in, verse 29. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, "If you will give the Ammonites into my hands, then whoever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return victorious from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, to be offered up by me as a burnt offering." So Jephthah crossed over to the Ammonites to fight against them, and the Lord gave them into his hand. Then Jephthah came to his home at Mizpah, and there was his daughter, coming out to meet him with timbrels and with dancing. She was his only child. He had no other son or daughter except her. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, "Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low. You have become the cause of great trouble to me, for I opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow." She said to him, "Father, if you have opened your mouth to the Lord, then do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth, now that the Lord has given you vengeance against your enemies, the Ammonites." "And," she said to her father, "but let this one thing be done for me. Give me 2 months, so that I may go and wander on the mountains and bewail my virginity, my companions and I." "Go," he said, and sent her away for 2 months. So she departed, she and her companions, and bewailed her virginity on the mountains. And at the end of the 2 months she returned to her father, who did with her according to the vow he had made. She had never slept with a man. So there arose an Israelite custom that for 4 days every year the daughters of Israel would go out to lament the daughter of Jephthah, the Gileadite. This story about the slaughter of Jephthah's daughter is probably one of the most disturbing stories in our Bible. And, if I'm honest, I love to preach it. I've preached on this story multiple times because even though this business of sacrificing a child is unbelievably, undeniably horrific, I find that if you apply the right hermeneutic and a little bit of imagination, the story is also rich with meaning. If you don't know the word hermeneutic, you might want to back up a couple of videos to the sermon I did on Deuteronomy, and that will tell you a little bit more about what a hermeneutic is. But for this particular story, for starters, I want to begin by giving this girl a name. You'll notice she's only referred to as Jephthah's daughter. We don't even know her name. So, we're going to give her one. I did this when I was preaching on this sermon at youth camp, and I asked the students to figure out a name for her. And since I can't hear you on the other side of this computer screen, we'll just go with their choice. They decided to name her Jessica. If your name happens to be Jessica, I'm sorry, wasn't my choice. But we've given her a name. Her name is Jessica. Now we have a girl with a name. We've already accomplished step 1 of a liberation hermeneutic. We have humanized her. Our method of interpreting the Bible includes naming the nameless, and by doing so, we make the oppressed one a central figure in the story rather than a secondary one. Next, let's fill in the scene. We have 2 main characters already, Jessica and her father Jephthah. We also kind of sort of have God, although God doesn't say or do much of anything in this story. In addition, if we're talking about a family unit here, someone really obvious has been left out. Who else would have been super impacted by what happened, even though the Bible doesn't mention her? her mom. Yeah, her mom. There's no way Jessica's death wouldn't have majorly impacted and disrupted her mother's life. So let's imagine for a moment Jessica's mom. I've imagined her many times. I've often thought about those 2 months that Jessica roamed the hills with her friends before she died, and I imagine Jessica's mom fighting with Jessica's dad daily, doing her dead level best to try to talk him out of the sacrifice. I imagine her screaming at him. I imagine her trying to talk sense into him. I imagine her sobs. Step 2 of a hermeneutic liberation. We have used our imaginations to picture who else is in the story, who got left out of the retelling, and we have put ourselves in their shoes and imagined how it affects them. Now, I've often pictured Jessica's mom on the day of the sacrifice, having lost the battle for her daughter's life. She couldn't bear to go with them and watch the sacrifice take place, so she stays home. And I picture her pacing the kitchen, pacing the yard, back and forth, pacing, waiting. And I have imagined her, after hours of pacing, seeing Jephthah appear on the horizon, returning home, and I imagine her mad dash towards him. I have imagined her grabbing him by the collar, then by the shoulder, shaking him violently. "Was there a ram?" she demands. Jephthah is confused and does not understand the question. So she begins to scream, "Damn you, Jephthah! Was there a ram? Like the ram for Isaac? Was there a ram for her?" This is step 3 of a liberation hermeneutic. We pay close attention when the passage we are reading tells a story that is inconsistent with who we know God to be. And in this case, there is a lot that is inconsistent with the character of God. We know God to be a God who provides rams, a God who rescues those in need, a God who values children and protects life. So then what the heck happened here? Why did Jessica have to die? Step 4, ask hard questions. And then imagine what some of the answers might be. You don't have to know for sure. You are allowed to make guesses. For example, maybe Jessica didn't have to die. Maybe they passed a dozen rams on their way to the altar, but Jephthah wasn't receptive to seeing them. Maybe God tried to intervene through Jessica's mom, but Jephthah wouldn't listen to her. Maybe Jephthah is a super lousy dad who never should have made such an idiotic vow in the first place. You know what I'm saying? Did you know there have been preachers throughout history who have actually praised Jephthah for his faithfulness and lifted him up as an example of extreme faith? Let's just call that BS out right here and now. Step 5 of a hermeneutic of liberation, tell the freaking truth and don't try to sugarcoat stuff you've got no business sugarcoating. Jephthah's vow to God was an act of unfaithfulness, period. First of all, God was already with him. The very first verse of the passage I read today said, "The Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah." That means the Spirit came to Jephthah's side before Jephthah made his vow. God was already with him. No vow necessary. Second of all, when he made the vow, what did he think was going to happen? That the first thing to walk out of his house to greet him on return from battle was going to be a fattened calf? Obviously, it would be a human being, and likely it would be his family. Third, God does not participate in the vow making. Notice God does not say, "Why, thank you, Jephthah. I was hoping you would make me just such an offer." No, Jephthah does all the talking. God is silent. This is not God's idea. And finally, no faithful to God person is so stubborn that they would keep a vow over saving their daughter's life. The point is that Jephthah's vow was wrong from the beginning. And to interpret the story well, we have to name the truth. Which, to put it nicely, is that Jephthah was an idiot. Any interpretation that fails to name Jephthah's actions as evil is not a healthy, honest, or Jesus-y interpretation. Once we fully recognize that God had nothing to do with Jephthah's vow, that leaves us with the question, where is God? Does God even make an appearance in a story like this one? Step 6, look for God. Look for evidence of grace. And in some ways, it is fair to say that this is a story in which God is absent, which is not unlike so many stories we know and hear. Like, where was God when a gunman showed up at a church in Sutherland Springs, or in Charleston, or at a school in Parkland, or a nightclub in Orlando? Where was God when that child was being abused, or where was God when that loved one died of cancer? There are lots of real-life tragedies in which God remains conspicuously, painfully absent. Interpreting this passage is hard because there is no liberation, no happy ending, no resolution, no joy, no resurrection. And yet I do think there are still a few details in this story worth noting as possible evidence of grace. In the Bible, Jessica responds to the news of her impeding sacrifice like this: "My father, you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me as you have promised." At first glance, she appears to submit to her father's vow. Perhaps she thinks it will please God or please her father to be compliant, or perhaps she knows that protesting won't accomplish anything. I mean, who knows what all she might be thinking? There is no guidebook for how to respond when your father decides to make a burnt offering out of you. But what I admire most about Jessica is that she does not go quietly. Even though she accepts her father's decision, she sets her own terms. She tells rather than asks her father, "Give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends." She wants a space of her own, separate and apart from her father, and she takes it. I mean, have you ever been blindsided by betrayal? Someone who was supposed to love and protect you harmed you instead? The world goes dark, doesn't it? You are lost. Up is down and down is up. Nothing makes sense. Can a child really be expected to defend herself against her father? It is his job to protect her and care for her. She has trusted him all her life. Her protector and her killer are now one. I mean, how could she possibly know what to do? It is incredible to me that she manages to name and insist on receiving something she needs. As a female child in the confines of a male-dominated culture, perhaps these 2 months of independence are the most she can imagine taking. Stress and oppression often stifle the imagination, but even in the face of death, her imagination persists. And I like to imagine those 2 months on the hills with her friends. After all, there are no chaperones, no rules, no examples. They had to create a way, some way to deal with the unbearable, and so they created something together. I mean, I imagine they did some grieving and crying and saying goodbye, but I also imagine these young women squeezing as much life into 2 months as humanly possible. I imagine them, figuring out what was on Jessica's bucket list and then doing all of it. I imagine them being wild and crazy. I imagine them telling stories and laughing hysterically and creating memories. I imagine them holding nothing back, being their full selves, because why would you be anything else but yourself when time is so very limited? I imagine the depth of friendship they shared. Now we have to imagine all of it because Scripture doesn't tell us any details about those 2 months, but I kind of like it that way because when I imagine it big and bold and beautiful. These were women who didn't have enough power to make the injustice stop or to keep it from happening. But they took the time they had and made something of it, and I think that is worth noting. The other thing that happens in the story is that after Jessica's death, every year afterwards, the daughters of Israel commemorate her death for 4 days. Every year, 4 days are devoted to her. There is even an old Jewish legend that says every year on the anniversary of her death, the water would turn to blood. So even if people wanted to forget her, they could not. In the biblical text, 3 times the narrator reminds us that Jessica is a virgin who will never marry. This is supposed to highlight the tragedy because hers is a life cut short. And in a culture where women were remembered and revered for bearing children, she will never bear children, never even have the chance to conceive. As a woman who dies young and with no children, we expect her to be forgotten and unknown. The biblical scholar Phyllis Tribble translates verse 39 this way, quote, "Although she had not known a man, nevertheless, she became a tradition." That is to say, Jessica defies her barren and brief existence and becomes something more. Even today, she is not forgotten. Even today, we remember her. The fact that Jephthah's daughter is remembered and her story told and retold is important because by remembering, we are empowered to imagine a different and better future. Final step of a liberation hermeneutic: look ahead. Imagine a future in which no child is ever sacrificed in the name of God, in the name of religion, in the name of border security or immigration law. Imagine a future in which mothers intervene and those in power listen. Imagine a future in which little girls are valued equally to little boys. Imagine a future in which children are safe from violence, safe from bad theology, safe from all forms of abuse. The reality is that this really is not a story with any kind of happy ending. But it is a story where, despite the horror of it all, some light shines through the cracks. This, I think, can be instructive for life because we can't always stop the bad stuff from happening. And while we work hard to stop injustice, we can't always stop that either. And yet there are opportunities, even amidst the terrible stuff life throws at us, to make meaningful friendships, to create beautiful things, and to make something of our lives. All it really takes is a little bit of imagination to see beyond the limits and grab hold of the present moment with all our hearts. So may you, my friends, be granted all the imagination you could ever possibly need. Amen.